Welcome, welcome, welcome in, everyone. Welcome to Care Concierge with Carepatrol, where education is the heart of everything that we do. We appreciate you being here today on a Friday of all days in healthcare. I know it's busy, and we appreciate you for being here with us. This is 2022's last Care Concierge with Carepatrol. We will resume in January, and that will be announced in an email that most of you, I think, will receive. Most of you should be on our email list now. And as well, you can always check carepatrol.com for my landing page, and you can find information there about our upcoming CEUs. I expect that we will have, I know we're having one on animal assisted therapy or pet therapy, which I look forward to. And then I hope we have one from my friend Phyllis Grauer, Dr. Phyllis Grauer, who does hospice pharmacy. And I think that will be interesting for anyone who works in the hospice realm. And then I want to bring back some ethics courses as well. I know those have been asked for very recently in our poll of asking folks what they'd like to see. So welcome to those of you who've just joined us with Care Concierge with Carepatrol. This is a service of Carepatrol, which is a free service to clients who are your patients and friends, church members, family members, folks that you know from the bank or from an attorney. Those are all the ways that we receive referrals. And what we do for our clients is what we hope we do today for you, which is educate. We educate our clients about what are the next steps in the healthcare journey for them, whether they are well and just looking for options in the future, or whether they're in a crisis situation and hospitalized. So we appreciate all of you for joining us. Thank you for the very nice notes. And Ms. King, I will add you to the email list. Which is pretty current, but if you think you're not on it, please let me know, and we'll send you the links for January. Carepatrol works with people to help them find out what is next, and we're free to them. And the way that we get paid is, and only when, what is next includes assisted living. Now, this asks a lot of things. It asks that someone can qualify in the state of Alabama for assisted living, and it asks that someone can afford assisted living, and you might think it also asks that someone wants to live in assisted living, but for the vast majority of people we help, it's not really a question anymore. It's the best option they have in front of them, and that's where we serve people. I hope we can serve you as well in other ways, both with clients and in this way. Today, we are joined by a friend who I'm glad to see back, Dr. Chandler Caldwell. He was scheduled to be with us in October and suffered a very serious car accident, and is recovering well, and continued prayers for his recovery, and many thanks to him for lending his credibility to ours. We appreciate that. As you know, those who've listened in before, our contact hours are accredited by the Alabama Board of Social Work Examiners, as well as the Alabama Board of Nursing Practitioners, and each of them allow us to create and credential and provide these to you. For nurses, we will post your hours to the ABN website on your behalf. Social workers, we cannot do that, but we provide you with an email and certificate to allow you to do the same, and we keep record of these for 7 years, by the way. Our evaluation is necessary for you to receive the contact hour, and that evaluation is via SurveyMonkey. I've listed it earlier in the chat for those of you who can see it, and I'm putting it again in the chat for those who just joined. And if you're not familiar with the chat, move your cursor to the bottom of top of your screen, either or. A bar will pop up or down, and you can find the word chat. Click on it. Also want to let everyone know today that you have the ability to unmute your mic. And I know that Dr. Caldwell would appreciate it, and I know that your peers on this call would appreciate knowing what your thoughts. But when the call is done and the conclusion and you want the CE, you contact our go-to SurveyMonkey. And that address is https://www.surveymonkey.com/r/all uppercase letters L W P as in Paul 6 C as in cat I as in I, or no, excuse me. I can't tell if that's an I or a J. Can y'all see it? Is it IJ or LJ? I'm so sorry, y'all. I cannot read that. My eyes got hushed on. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. Let me now introduce Dr. Caldwell. It's an L. Thank you. CLJ. So again, the SurveyMonkey address is https://www.surveymonkey.com/r/all uppercase letters L W P as in Paul 6 C as in cat L J. Thank you, Daniel Mitchell, for letting us know that. And now I will cede the floor to our good friend and Doctor of Social Work, Dr. Chandler Caldwell. Thank you so much, Dr. Caldwell, for being here.
Thank you so much, Sean. And it is really great to see so many folks. I see some familiar names. Shout out to my 3 social work supervisees that I am mentoring for their clinical supervision. They're on the Zoom today. So hello. So today we're going to be talking about issues and trends associated with dementia caregiving. So when I was getting my doctorate, this was something that I researched pretty heavily, because when we think about dementia, we think about the patient, you know, the client. We think about what they're going through and what that experience is like. But very rarely do we ask, well, how is the caregiver doing? And what is that experience like for them? How can we help from them? So this presentation is going to kind of give an overview of what dementia is, you know, some of the issues that caregivers face, and also we're going to talk about 2 of the biggest studies that have been done on this topic, and that might be able to give you some, I guess, nuggets of knowledge to help caregivers that are in that role. So let's see if I can get, okay. So the objectives for today are, you know, pretty simple. First one is to increase awareness about dementia-related issues, to increase awareness about dementia caregiving, and to identify at least 3 issues related to dementia caregiving. So what is dementia? So you hear a lot of people who will say, well, they don't have dementia, but they have Alzheimer's disease, or they don't, you know, they've got, you know, Lewy body, but they don't have dementia. Well, I want you to think of dementia as like the, you know, umbrella term that can describe many, many different types of dementia. And I used to have a graphic that I would put in here, but for some reason I couldn't find it on my computer. But dementia is a term that really describes how the brain changes that are abnormal, and that, you know, ultimately affects a person's cognitive functioning and really impacts independence as the disease progresses. These changes disrupt communication between cells in the brain, which is key to living a healthy life and being, cognitively intact. Unfortunately, this disorder disrupts that communication, which really affects a person's, quality of life. And it can interfere with social engagement and create psychological or behavioral distress. So the World Health Organization, emphasizes that dementia is not part of the normal aging process. So have you ever heard, well, my granddad, he's 85, he's just got dementia because he's old. Well, your grandfather might have dementia, but it's not necessarily because he's old. That's not part of the normal aging process. It's a chronic illness that derives from multiple causes. It can be hereditary to some extent. It can be from an ecological, perspective, your environment, your diet. I mean, all kinds of things can go into, what causes dementia. The World Health Organization estimates that an individual is diagnosed with dementia every 3 seconds. So I want you to just think about how staggering that is just for a second. So just in this 12 minutes that we have been talking, that's been dozens and dozens of people have been diagnosed with dementia. Nearly 50 million individuals live with a diagnosis of dementia worldwide. And what's even more staggering is that this increases by about 10 million a year, and it's expected to go up to more than 152 million cases of dementia across the world by 2050. And I know 2050 may seem like a long, far way out, but it is right around the corner. We are almost in 2023. And the fact that, if you think of America's population, which I think is now it's around 330-ish million, then this would make up half of America if all of these cases were in the US. That's a pretty staggering number. So symptoms don't always appear early on. You can have dementia for years and not have any signs or symptoms. But symptoms do start to occur when those neurons in the brain that are responsible for memory and learning and thinking are destroyed due to the disease progressing. And ultimately, a lot of these cases, these patients lose neurons that aid in managing, bodily functions, walking, completing activities of daily living, swallowing, and breathing. So if you have worked in healthcare, or you've worked in hospice, or you've worked at a hospital, anything like that, you've probably seen patients living with dementia that have trouble swallowing. So they're on like a all liquid diet, or they have difficulty feeding themselves because their brain, has forgotten how to feed itself. Things like that. So those symptoms do start to pick up. And then at the end of the disease cycle results in individuals becoming bedbound and receiving around-the-clock support from family, caregivers, or healthcare providers until death. So I know, a lot of you do work in healthcare, and I'm sure you have either personally seen this or professionally seen this happen, where someone with dementia ends up just not being able to take care of themselves whatsoever, and they are bedbound and they have to receive that around-the-clock care. And that puts us in a really sticky place because, most of the time caregivers in particular have jobs of their own. They have other, responsibilities, and putting that added responsibility of having to provide 24/7 care can really cause a lot of problems. So, like I said earlier, dementia is not part of the normal aging process. Despite developments in this realm of medicine, there's still not a cure for dementia. And, like I said earlier, although there may be evidence in the brain that something is going on, sometimes those symptoms are not noticeable until you start having problems with memory or language. And then Wang and his colleagues report that as of 2021, dementia affects more than 4% of the global population aged 60 or older. So that's a lot of people, a lot of folks that are impacted by this. All right, so this is just a visual of what a normal brain looks like versus a brain that has been impacted by Alzheimer's disease, which is a form of dementia. So as you'll see, it's smaller, it looks damaged. I mean, even the color looks different. And if you look up, like on Google, like autopsied brains of people who had, suspected dementia, I mean, even the color sometimes looks different. So this is a good visual. And as you can see, the hippocampus pretty much is non-existent. The cerebral cortex shrinks. So this is just a good visual to show you what physically changes in the brain. So this is another good visual of the activity in the brain. So on your left, you see a normal brain, and all those colors indicate activity in the brain. So that person on the left has a normal functioning brain. Then you look in the middle, and that is someone that has a mild cognitive impairment. So these are people who, still can live independently for the most part, may have, some like memory issues, but in general, they are not, they don't require a whole lot of extra care. On the right-hand side, you'll see someone that has Alzheimer's disease, like I said, which is a form of dementia. And that black space in the middle just shows you where the brain has pretty much died and there is no activity there. So I think this is a good visual to show you, just how much can happen over the course of time, especially between mild cognitive impairment and when you may get a diagnosis of dementia. So what's the role and impact of caregiving? So nearly half of all caregivers in the US, about 48%, provide care for people living with dementia. That is a lot of people, y'all. I mean, if you think about just how many people require a caregiver at any stage of any illness, and almost half of those are providing care for someone with dementia, that is a big indicator that this is an issue. Nearly 2/3 of caregivers of people living with dementia are female, and around 34% are 65 or older. So, when you think about that 34% being 65 or older, these are people who are getting ready to retire, who are entering that older stage of the development in life. They're slowing down as well. So, when you add someone that's in their 80s or 90s who needs 24/7 care, or even, like moderate care where you really have to provide supervision, that can really add some stress. And what's really interesting is that 25% of caregivers of people living with dementia are categorized as the sandwich generation. This means that they are caring for a patient with dementia, but they're also caring for their own kids. So I have seen this a lot where you've got the patient who is being cared for by their kids, but their kids also have kids. So that's why they're called the sandwich generation, because they've got the patient, and then they're in the middle. So this is the bread, the caregiver's the meat, and then you have the younger kids as the other side of the bread. So you've got a sandwich generation, and that causes a lot of distress and a lot of helplessness. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. Something else that I have found interesting is that as of 2022, the number of caregivers between 18 to 29 has increased by 7% since 2015. So that's pretty significant. I am in my 30s now, and I think back to when I was 18 to 29, and that is, you're still learning about yourself. You're trying to figure things out. You're an adult, but you're not quite mentally prepared to be a caregiver. But a lot of people are choosing to do so, or don't have much of a choice because they have a loved one that needs them. And overall, that's just a tough place to be in. So caregivers obviously have a very challenging role that has been known to have a direct impact on social and physical health. It's not uncommon for caregivers to experience stress, strain, psychological and physical illness, social isolation, and financial hardship. So a lot of research indicates that people who do provide care to others experience more of these issues than those who are not caregivers. And a lot of times the patients or clients who need the care do not have the financial means to pay for care. So financial burden alone is worth noting, as more than 90% of patients in the community rely on unpaid caregiver support. So this means that their kids or their spouse or neighbors, cousins, whoever is helping take care of them. And researchers have found that caregiving is most intense for people in the community who live with people with dementia, like a spouse, child, or another family member. So people who live in the same home and are there 24/7 with very little, respite or time away to care for themselves, certainly causes problems. Oops. So the individuals with dementia was compared to non-dementia caregivers, and dementia have more biomarkers for chronic diseases than non-dementia caregivers. So this is not
Sorry,
even.
Dr. Caldwell, would you repeat that? It may happen just to me, but it may have happened for others. That froze up when you made your initial point.
Okay, sorry about that, y'all. So this review found that caregivers of individuals with dementia have more biomarkers for chronic disease than non-dementia caregivers. So this is not just a social or psychological thing. This is a biological thing as well. And this research that was done shows that. So these biomarkers indicate a higher risk for hypertension, cardiovascular disease, hyperglycemia, immune dysfunction, and death. It was also discovered that dementia caregivers experience a more active sympathetic nervous system by changes in blood pressure, and I've never been able to pronounce those last two things, but there you go. So increased levels of burden and distress are noted among dementia caregivers. When compared to caregivers of individuals with other chronic and terminal illnesses, really dementia caregivers' well-being is at an increased risk. And, like we have kind of talked about, when dementia progresses, it can make a, patient or client bedbound. And so this increased risk is likely due to the caregivers offering more hours of care, money for medications and supplies, and assistance with activities of daily living than non-dementia caregivers. So dementia is a really complex disease, not only for the patient, but for the caregivers and the providers that are trying to help these patients, because dementia is not a one-size-fits-all type of disease. It can look different in each and every person that you work with or you love. And that's why it's so hard, because you can't necessarily write a manual on how to be the perfect caregiver or how to make caregiving, easy, because we can't predict how it's going to look with that particular person. So some of the things that, impact caregiving and their mental health are negative behavioral changes in the patient, such as aggression and irritability. Those two things have a substantial impact on the mental health of caregivers. And, when you think about that, when you're being hit or you're being bitten, or the person you're trying to care for is irritable all the time, and they're just really, really difficult to work with, then of course that's going to have a substantial impact on your mental health, physical health, and just overall life. It is noted that a lot of these behaviors can be associated with an increased risk of depression and other mental health issues. So caregivers are at a higher risk of depression and other mental health problems if these behaviors occur. So, a lot of you, I'm sure, have seen patients with dementia who have, what we commonly call behavioral disturbances. And that can look different for, each and every patient that we work with. But that does increase the risk of depression and other mental health issues with caregivers. One study explored what factors influence the likelihood of depression. They found that 3 dimensions affect caregiver burden. One is emotional exhaustion, which I think is a very fair point. Depersonalization, and a reduction in personal accomplishment. So they get just consumed by caregiving and don't feel like they accomplish much else in their daily lives. So caregiver distress may lead to caregiver burnout. This study found that patients' aggressive behaviors, irritability, abnormal motor functioning, and hallucinations cause the most burnout among dementia caregivers. But the researchers also made a very clear distinction that distress does not always lead to burnout. And if you came to my self-care talk that I did, I believe back in August or September, you may remember that we talked about burnout, and burnout is where you are physically, emotionally, and mentally exhausted. So they made it clear that distress does not always lead to burnout, but it is an indicator that you're at a higher risk. So numerous studies examined variables that impact mental stress and caregiver depression. Wiegelman and colleagues conducted a review of studies that examined 4 factors that includes the mental health of caregivers. First, they highlight how gender, the relationship you have with the patient, cohabitation, and financial strain had an impact on caregiver mental health. They also examined how health-related variables were related to decreased mental health. They looked at a patient's health condition, the type of dementia, behavioral issues, inability to complete ADLs, and other psychiatric symptoms impacted caregivers. The third was caregivers' variables were closely examined and how they served as a risk or protective factor. In addition, Wiegelman and colleagues examined how increasing emotional expression, poor attachment styles, low confidence in caregiving roles, isolation, and poor coping strategies were primary risk factors for the development of depression. And relationship variables such as quality of the relationship and levels of intimacy were explored as a risk or protective factor associated with caregiver mental health. And when they say, intimacy, they're not meaning sexual intimacy. They're meaning, are we, intimate in the way that we touch people? Do we hug people? Do we touch their shoulder? Are we intimate with our words? Are we kind? Are we loving? How does that impact our relationships with who we're taking care of? And it does have a big impact.
May I interrupt and ask a question? There was on the previous slide, it said poor attachment styles. That's new to me. What does that mean?
So attachment styles is really something that we talk about in childhood, about how you attach to a parent or you attach to a sibling or something like that. But when you have dementia, you almost revert back to childlike behaviors in a lot of ways. So attachment is really, how, what does that relationship look like between the patient and the caregiver? Is that attachment a good attachment? Is that attachment strained? Is it a hostile attachment? Like me, if I was taking care of, my dad, for example, that would, we have a good attachment style. So that would be loving. But say that, I was the niece of a very mean, uncle, then that may be more of a hostile attachment, and that can really serve as a risk factor for burnout and mental health issues.
Got it. Thank you. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Let's see. So some issues and barriers to caregiving. So most caregivers, they don't have any formal training or experience working with patients with dementia. Like I said earlier, there is no book or training class or orientation that every caregiver gets that says this is what can help you. This is an ongoing issue that is rooted in gaps and knowledge rather than a reluctance to learn. So, you have a lot of people that are caregiving that really have no idea about the progression of dementia. And that's part of our roles as nurses and social workers, is to educate them about that disease progression and what may or may not help. I've worked with the older population, pretty much for most of my career in some capacity, mostly in mental health. And I've done a lot of psychoeducation about the progression of the disease. And it really is shocking just how little caregivers know. And it's not that they don't want to learn, it's that they just don't know where to go to get that knowledge. And so, Peterson and his colleagues explored, well, what's going on, and what affects a caregiver's experience. And they found that caregivers receive insufficient information about their loved one's disease, caregiving needs, and resources in the community. So a lot of times it's like, oh, well, we think your loved one has, dementia. They're going to need more care. Bye-bye. We'll see you in 6 months for your regular checkup. That's what's happening most of the time when you go into your doctor's office or you see a neurologist or something like that. There is not a whole lot of resources there to help you get started or point you in the direction of being able to handle this in a positive way. So caregivers are open to learning, and they want to learn from various sources, but they don't know where to begin. And if you type in Google dementia, you're going to get a billion different things about dementia. And so they really rely on and expect their primary care physicians to suggest or recommend resources for information that's in the best interest of the patient. But this is not happening in most settings. I say most because I know that the culture in doctors' offices are changing. We're now seeing doctors' offices that are specifically for older adults. Some doctors, really only want to work with people who have a diagnosis of dementia. So we're seeing some of that pop up. But in general, you're going in, the doctor thinks you may have dementia, but that's pretty much the end of the conversation unless they refer you to someone else. So it's just a big gap that we as social workers and nurses really have to try and fill to the best of our ability. So there's a few things that can help caregivers. So these are just two things I'll talk about for the next 10, 12 minutes or so. So support groups and education groups. And then, like I mentioned at the very beginning, these are two of the biggest studies that have been done on caregivers of people living with dementia. And we'll talk a little bit about what they found helpful. So support groups is a easy thing to do. It's cost efficient, and it has a proven record of being successful in helping caregivers. So Chan and colleagues conducted a big meta-analysis that examined the impact of traditional in-person support groups. So this was before Zoom and Teams and all these awesome, technology things that we can use now. But it found that support groups have a substantial impact on caregiver mental health. And these support groups are found to have the most significant impact on psychological well-being, depression, burden, and social outcomes. So I think, support groups, for anything really, but specifically with dementia, when you're around other people that understand what you're going through, they understand how hard it is, that in itself is a huge, huge help. So that's great. So this group of researchers discussed how caregivers rarely receive instruction or training about how to be effective caregivers. They found that sorry, I had like word salad there for a second. They conducted a study that provided an educational intervention to 300 self-identified caregivers of people living with dementia. So these 300 caregivers received the same education. And their data showed that it really decreased the perception of not being competent following the intervention. So it showed that education and training has a huge impact on preventing burden in caregivers, especially if they seek help earlier in the process instead of waiting until it's too late. So REACH. So this is kind of a cool study because we had one site here in Birmingham, Alabama, but it studied 495 caregiver dyads across 6 cities in the US, all the way from California to Boston and Miami, Birmingham, Philadelphia, Memphis. So all over the US. So the intervention group completed a comprehensive assessment that really allowed the research team to tailor interventions for each caregiver and patient dyad. So this was not a one-size-fits-all study. This was, how, based on the assessment that we did, how can we tailor interventions to help you? And these interventions were implemented over 9 home visits and 3 telephone calls. So these visits and interventions primarily were counseling based and covered topics including home safety, emotions, stress, behavioral issues, and community resources. And on top of that, they received supportive material that was tailored to their individual needs. The study ultimately found that caregivers reported improved health, sleep, physical and emotional health, and felt less burdened and stressed with caregiver responsibilities after receiving the intervention. They looked at the health prior and post study, or pre and post study. They looked at caregiver burden pre and post intervention, and both the primary and secondary measures of health status and caregiver burden indicated substantial improvements. So I just found this interesting. The location in Birmingham was only one of 2 sites that served the South. This was significant because they were able to offer this to a lot of rural, low income, and racially diverse communities. Birmingham was second to Philadelphia in terms of African American participants. These percentages were substantially higher than the overall sample size of African Americans in the study. So if you look at the overall study, only 24.2% of the study were African Americans. But if you look at Birmingham and Philadelphia at 42% and 47%, they did a really good job of recruiting a diverse sample size in those 2 cities. They were also able to recruit people that had Hispanic backgrounds from Birmingham. So I thought that was really cool that we were able to collect data from such a diverse population. So COPE was conducted in Pennsylvania. So this is another big study. Recruitment lasted for 2 years. After screening was completed, they were able to form 270 dyads of the patient and the caregiver for the study. So this was designed to reduce environmental stressors and to enhance caregiving skills and patient capabilities. This study really focused on functional dependence, quality of life, agitation or behavioral issues, engagement with patients, well-being, confidence in caregiver activities, and caregivers' perception of participation. And that's participation as a caregiver and the patient participating in their care. So 10 home visits from an occupational therapist and 1 visit from an advanced practice nurse happened for this intervention. The support from occupational therapy helped caregivers learn how to adapt the environment for patients living with them so they can live as independently and safely as possible. And this, overall helped reduce stress and burden in the home. In conjunction to the occupational therapist, nursing services provided were to aid the medication management, providing education to caregivers, and managing care plans. So, that was really great, especially the providing education caregivers. So each outcome measure improved significantly for the intervention group. In contrast, the control group had relatively poor outcome measures because they didn't receive any intervention. Gitlin and colleagues ultimately validated that living with dementia can be managed by non-pharmacologic interventions, such as caregiver support and education, home modifications, and safety planning and routine support. So just to kind of wrap this up, REACH and COPE, which were the big studies we just talked about, were effective due to the increased support experienced by caregivers and the patients. They received individualized interventions, in-home support, telephonic support, and appropriate education that was geared towards dementia and caregiving. Both studies addressed issues that have been noted in literature about dementia, specifically the gap-rooted the gaps that we see in education and training, and just that general knowledge about dementia and how to provide care to people living with dementia. So they did a really good job with that. So if you go online and you want to learn more about these two studies, they happened quite a bit ago, but they're still very much relevant today. Let's see. So that one's done. Yeah, we've talked about this, about how, most caregivers are untrained and lack education. COPE and REACH address this issue by incorporating both written and verbal education of patients and caregivers. We've talked about that. And isolation is a big issue in caregiving, and this also addressed that because they were having regular contact with somebody. Someone was coming in the home, or someone was calling them, and I think small things like that can really go a long way, because they both increase that human interaction. All right. So, any questions?
Y'all remember you can unmute your mics for discussion or enter questions into the chat room. It's so interesting to me, Dr. Caldwell, that your topics tend to revolve around self-care and caregiving, which are topics that I think are central to all of us. And we've done some workshop or courses on dementia caregiving and the number of caregivers, and it is astonishing. I put just the numbers in that you were giving, and I think three people every or one person every 3 seconds being diagnosed with dementia is like 7,200 people or something over 12 minutes. It's just nuts. And I did have a question for you, which I found interesting too. What do you attribute the growth in caregivers between 18 and 29? What could be driving that, do you think?
That's something that has kind of struck me as well. And it's something that I have thought about. And, I think it is most likely because maybe their parents are, like working, and a lot of people in that age group are in college, or they're, not quite reached, what most of us would call full-blown adulthood. But I'm not sure. I think that's a really interesting little kind of nugget of interest that I would love for someone to do a study on, and really survey that. Because even in my own practice, I have seen the age of caregivers decrease, substantially. Some of them are not in their 60s anymore. You're seeing 25-year-olds or 20-year-olds. I met a 20-year-old, the other day that was taking care of her grandmother who's on hospice, and it's just astonishing to me that someone that young is picking up, the slack, and helping where they need to be helped.
So courageous, I think, and
That
selfless
is,
for someone that age. Alice DeLois Alexander has a question,
yeah.
which is, Dr. Chandler, how to prevent burnout in caregivers?
I think, I think like what we talked about, getting into a support group, taking care of yourself, self-care is really important. And I know that, self-care is like a buzzword that people like to use, but it really is important. But I think getting the right support at the right time is vital. Getting it early, getting it regularly, and having a good support system, whether that be friends or family members or whatever. I think just getting that support and getting that help early on is important. So I look at it as more of, let's be proactive in addressing burnout than being reactive to burnout. So let's put these things in place to avoid burnout versus trying to climb out of that hole of burnout, because it's a lot harder to climb out than it is to avoid.
She says there are limited resources in rural America.
There is. Absolutely.
And I think that may be lead to the other statistic you mentioned, which is that 90% of people who have dementia are cared for by unpaid caregivers.
Yeah, it's crazy. It is crazy because there's not resources. There may not be sitter services that go out to these rural areas, or the family can't afford them. I've had families in the past that would spend $6,000 a month on caregiving services, around the clock care. And most people don't have that kind of money, especially in, like rural communities where they're usually in a, like a lower socioeconomic group. So it's hard. I mean, I wish I had a good answer or an answer that was super helpful, but I think that's an area that we as social workers and nurses, we need to try and fill that gap and try and bring resources to those communities and really advocate for that.
Well, the Alice DeLois Alexander is saying, and I've seen this with my own clients, the VA will pay for a caregiver for a veteran. They will, up to a point. Now, it's not every day. In fact, my client, I think, was getting service maybe one day a week for 4 hours. So, that it certainly helps, but it's not the solution. And just to correct you on the cost today, to show you the increase since your client was in, it's now over $12,000 a month for 24/7 caregivers. It's $160,000 a year. It is more than the nursing home.
It's crazy. And I don't know anybody that could afford that. I mean, just out of the blue. Now, I mean, I have some clients right now that saved really well, and they prepared to have increased care, but they didn't choose to have sitters in the home. They decided to go to assisted living or something like that, where, if you save, which is still expensive, but it's not $160,000 a year expensive.
Yeah, it's more like 60,000. And that's really what keeps us in business, is helping people find that option that's great care, safe, and also within budget. And just, one thing I would point out is you were asking who can talk to people about, I mean, that's what we do. at Carepatrol is talk to people about what's coming up. So if ever there was a place for us to slide in, it's when you have those clients that have those questions and you can't answer them. You know, we have the time to do that. And, you know, again, we're free. We'd like to be paid eventually, but we're not always.
Absolutely.
And Ms. Carpenter says, unfortunately, the aid and attendance benefits are only available if the veteran had boots on the ground during wartime, and what financial assistance one may receive if eligible is based on their income. From my understanding, that's not correct, Ms. Carpenter. The only time you have to have boots on the ground was in the early days of Vietnam, and this would be like 64 to 66, I believe. But then after 67 or 68, you simply have to have been in the service, active duty for at least 90 days, honorably discharged, 24 hours of which was in the service or during wartime, even if you weren't deployed. Now, there are asset income levels. It's, you know, they try and follow Medicaid, but the fact is we've seen people with $320,000 in assets get aid and attendance. They just don't get the full benefit. But the beauty of aid and attendance for anyone that is on the precipice is it back pays. It backdates to the date of application. So if you go ahead and get an application in, then once it's approved, it'll back pay you all those many months of pay and then pay you monthly going forward. So, you know, it is maybe the best benefit the federal government has going that so few people know about. And even now, what we see is we don't see Korean vets much. We definitely don't see WW2 vets anymore. We see Vietnam vets now, but a lot of them, to Ms. Carpenter's point, weren't boots on the ground in the early days of the war, so they don't get the benefit.
Yeah, and you know, for people who didn't serve in the armed forces, I mean, they're just pretty much out of luck in a lot of ways because there's not resources. There's some, you know, I know Medicaid has a program, I think it's called like Your Choices or Personal Choices or something like that, where they'll pay a family member to help provide care to somebody. And then there's Medicaid waiver that will come in and help do light housekeeping and things like that. But there's really not a good resource to, you know, really solve this problem or address it effectively. So it's a tough one.
I agree. What it is who's going to solve is going to be good people like you, Dr. Caldwell, and the good people on this call. And we've run over y'all. I apologize for keeping you. Thank you again, Dr. Caldwell. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you and to everyone. The holidays or holidays is our password. I think many of you have gathered that by now, but if you don't know it already, holidays, plural, with capital H, is the password for the evaluation which I've given out earlier. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We appreciate you. Hope you have a terrific new year, and we'll see you then.